He paid 8 cents for an abandoned coal mine. 4 starving sisters were hiding inside. The deed was already in my coat pocket when I heard the sound. Not a cave-in sound, not the groan of old timber settling. Something else. Something small and alive, deep in the dark past the third bend where the main shaft split into 2 narrower ones, and I had not yet walked that far. I had a lantern. I had a pry bar I carried out of habit, left over from 22 years of mine work. I had 8 cents less than I'd started the morning with, which was almost nothing to begin with, so I figured I hadn't lost much. The Hargrove County Land Office had been happy to be rid of the Millard seam. The clerk barely looked up when I slid the coins across his counter. "Condemned mine," he said. "Cave risk in the lower shaft. No coal worth pulling. Good luck to you, Mr. Cutter." I wasn't even sure why I bought it. That's the honest answer. It sat on 40 acres of scrub high grass at the base of Table Rock, which is a hill that looks like someone took a cleaver to the top of a mountain and left the stump. The land was rough and the water rights were poor, and the mine itself was damp and black and had not been worked since the Millard family pulled out in '81. 14 years empty. Maybe I thought I could get something from the shale. Maybe I was just tired of sitting in the room above Deckard's Hardware and watching the wall. My wife Alina had been gone 2 winters. I had stopped planning things after that. You don't know you've stopped until somebody asks you what you're going to do next spring, and you realize you haven't thought that far. I was 54 years old, and I had a pry bar and 8 cents less than nothing, and a piece of paper that said I owned a hole in a hill. That sound again. A cough, a child's cough, wet and sharp, and then a hush, and then another smaller, like something being quieted by something else. I stopped walking, set the lantern on the ground, and just stood there in the smell of old coal dust and groundwater listening. More quiet than before, the kind of quiet that is not empty, the kind where people are holding their breath. I said, loud enough to carry, "I'm not here to put anybody out. I just bought this place this morning and I came to see what I had. I'm going to set this lantern down and step back to the first bend. You can look at it before I come any further." I did exactly that, walked back to where the shaft turned and sat on a low shelf of rock and waited. I waited a long time, 10 minutes, maybe 15. The lantern threw orange light up the shaft and I could see my own shadow stretched long behind me and hear water dripping somewhere deeper in. Then I heard footsteps, careful, slow, 2 different weights, and a woman came around the bend. She was tall, maybe 30, maybe a little older. Dark hair pulled back with a piece of cord. Cheekbones that could have been cut from the same rock as the walls. She had a blanket across her shoulders that had started out as 2 different blankets and been stitched together somewhere in the middle, and she wore it like a coat. Her eyes went to the pry bar in my hand first, then to my face. I set the bar down on the rock beside me, didn't make a show of it, just set it down. She watched me do that. I said, "How many of you are there?" "4," she said. Her voice was low and careful. Her English was better than mine, precise and unhurried, which I learned later was because she'd been taught by a woman in Omaha who believed in full sentences. Her name was Essa. That's what she told me, just Essa for then. 4, I said, "How long?" She thought about it, 12 days here. Before that, she paused, and the pause had a lot of country in it since March. It was October. I said, "Are the others all right?" "The youngest one is not well," she said. That was the cough I'd heard. I picked up the lantern and left the pry bar on the rock and walked with her back into the dark. There were 4 of them in a widening of the shaft about 80 feet in, where somebody at some point had cut a small chamber out of the rock. A powder room, probably, or a place to store equipment. Low ceiling, enough floor space that 3 people could lie down if one of them didn't mind having their feet in the wall. They'd made a fire using the broken remains of an old support timber. The smoke worked its way out through cracks in the ceiling and the ventilation shaft that ran up the far wall. Smart. They'd looked at the place and figured out what it could do for them. 3 sisters sat against the back wall with a 4th, the youngest, the one who'd coughed, lying with her head in the lap of the one on the left. Essa introduced them, but I won't give all 4 names here, not the way it happened. I'll say only that they ranged from about 20 down to maybe 11, and the youngest was feverish and had been since before they reached the mine, and the cough had come on 4 days ago and was getting worse at night. I crouched down and looked at the girl. Her name was Weena. She had her sister's high cheekbones and her eyes were glassy, and she was breathing in short pulls like each one cost something. I said to Essa, she needs a doctor. Essa looked at me a long moment. In Morrow, she said, there is no doctor who will see us. I knew she was right. I'd lived in Morrow County 11 years. I knew exactly what the doctor in Red Fork would say, and I knew what the men in Linden Creek would do if 4 Cheyenne women walked into town alone in October. I'd watched enough of it to know I'd never done a thing about it, which was its own kind of wound I hadn't looked at straight since Aliner died. I said, the doctor in Casper. It was 40 miles. She said nothing for a moment. Then, you would do this. I said I would do this. I need to tell you what those 40 miles looked like, because otherwise it sounds simple, and it was not simple. I had a wagon that I borrowed from old Deckard, who thought I was hauling salvage from the mine and didn't ask much. I had a bedroll and a canvas tarp and 2 wool blankets from my room above the hardware, and the flour and dried beans and bacon I'd been planning to last me 2 more weeks. I drove back to Table Rock before dark, pulled the wagon into the draw below the mine entrance where it couldn't be seen from the road, and Essa came out alone to talk to me. She said her 3 sisters would not leave the mine that night. They had learned what happened when they moved after dark, and I didn't push her to explain. I asked if I could bring the food in. She said yes. I carried it in myself, 2 trips, and I met the other 2 sisters properly, and I crouched down and put my hand on Weena's forehead, and she was burning. I said to Essa, what is her full name? Weena Tallgrass Whitehorse, she said. I said it back to her so she'd know I had it right. She looked at me then in a way that I felt in my chest. Not softness, I don't mean that. More like she was recalibrating something, like she'd been ready for a different kind of man and had to adjust. I slept in the wagon that night, wrapped in the extra canvas with my boots on and the rifle across my knees, which probably sounds dramatic, but there'd been a man on the road when I came in, rider, moving slow. No reason to be out that late that far from town, and I had learned enough in my years to trust that prickle at the back of my neck. Nobody came. In the morning, I made a fire outside the mine entrance and cooked beans, and Essa came out and stood with me while they cooked, and she told me, bit by bit, the way you tell a stranger things when you're not sure how much to give, just enough, then watch, then a little more. They had come from up north in a group larger than 4. I won't say more than that. By the time they reached this part of Wyoming, they were alone. A woman in a sod house east of Red Fork had hidden them 2 nights and given them dried corn and pointed them toward the abandoned mine on Table Rock, which she'd heard was empty. They had walked 6 miles in the dark to reach it. She had been watching me as she talked, not suspicious exactly, measuring. I said, I'm going to get your sister to a doctor. I'm going to have to put it to him in a way he can't say no to. I'm a man who spent 22 years underground. I know how to shore up a wall. She said, what does that mean? It means I know how to hold something up from the inside until the ground stops wanting to fall. She was quiet for a moment. She said, and after. I hadn't thought that far, or I had a little in the night, but I hadn't decided. I said, after we figure out what comes next, one thing at a time. She nodded, like that was a reasonable answer, like it was more than she'd expected. We left for Casper the next morning at first light. Weena in the wagon bed on the bedroll, Essa beside her. The 2 middle sisters, I'll call them me and Calla, the names I came to use, on the bench seat with me. The road was empty for the first 10 miles, and then it joined the main trace, and there were other wagons going the other direction, mostly. I kept my eyes forward and drove like a man who knew where he was going. Nobody stopped us. The trouble came in Linden Creek. It was unavoidable. Linden Creek sat across the only good crossing of the Powder River for 30 miles in either direction, and the bridge fee was run by a man named Colbert who had a brother on the county commission and a belief that the territory was his to administer personally. He had 2 men with him. One of them I recognized from a cattle drive 3 years back. The other was younger and had the look of someone trying to be more than he was. Colbert looked at the wagon, looked at me and Calla on the bench seat, looked at me. He said, these yours? I said, they're with me. He said, I asked you something different. I said, I heard you, and I answered you, they're with me. I've got a sick girl in back, needs a doctor in Casper today. The bridge fee is 20 cents. I've got it right here. He didn't take the coins right away. He walked around to the back of the wagon and looked at Weena and Essa looked back at him with a face that gave him nothing. He stood there a moment. I could feel the 2 men behind me without turning around, and I kept my hands where they were on the reins. Colbert came back to my side of the wagon. He said, "You know what you're hauling here." I said, "I know exactly what I'm hauling. 20 cents, Mr. Colbert." He looked at me a long time. Long enough that me shifted slightly on the seat next to me, and I reached over without looking at her and put my hand briefly on her arm. "Just a second, just the way you do to say. Hold still, I have this." Colbert took the coins. He stepped aside, and I drove across that bridge without looking back. We made Casper by late afternoon. The doctor's name was Alderman. Horatio Alderman, 60 years old, gray-whiskered, the kind of man who'd seen enough of everything that surprise had mostly worn away. He was not pleased when I walked into his office followed by Essa carrying Weena and me and Calla behind her. But I had known Aldo Bream in the county office who knew Alderman, and I'd used those 11 years in Morrow County to establish that I was a man who paid his debts and kept his word. I said what needed saying quietly in the hallway, and Alderman listened. He examined Weena for 20 minutes. Pleurisy, he said, not the worst case he'd seen. Treatable if she rested and stayed warm and took the medicine he'd give her. He said to Essa, "She cannot travel again for at least 2 weeks." Essa looked at me. I said to Alderman, "Is there a boarding house in town that'll have them?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "My sister-in-law rents rooms. She's a sensible woman. I'll speak to her." It cost me what I had left. I will not dress that up. I had $7 and some change to my name at that point, and the rooms were $4 for 2 weeks, and the medicine was $1.50. I had about $2 and some cents when I walked out of Alderman's office, which was nearly nothing and then some. I told Essa what I'd arranged. She stood in the hallway and listened. She said, "You have used everything." I said, "I have enough to get back tomorrow." She said, "And then?" I said, "I'll find something. There's salvage in that mine worth pulling out if I look hard enough. The timber alone." She said, "You do not know that." I said, "No, but I know how to get it if it's there." She looked at me a moment. Then she said, "I would like to know your name, your full name." I told her, Caleb Amos Cutter. She said it back to me, all three, the same way I'd said Weena's. I drove back tomorrow alone. I am going to be honest about those 2 weeks because they matter. I had very little and the room above Deckard's was cold, and I ate badly and worked worse. I went to the mine every day and I pulled timber and I sorted what was sound from what was rotten, and I stacked the sound pieces near the entrance. There was also, it turned out, a vein of decent coal in the upper right branch of the shaft that the Millards had missed or ignored, not deep, not a fortune, but real. I started cutting it with the hand tools I had. My back hurt. My knees hurt. I was 54 years old and alone, and I had $2 and change, and I thought about Alina a lot those 2 weeks. Not with grief exactly, more like talking to her in my head the way you do when you're doing something she would have had something to say about. She would have had something to say about this. She would have said, "Well, Cutter, you finally did something with yourself." I got a letter from Essa on the 10th day. It came through Aldo Bream's address, which I'd arranged before I left. Short, careful handwriting. She said Weena was improving. She said me and Calla were well. She said Dr. Alderman had been to see them twice more without charging. She said she had something to tell me when she returned. I read it about 4 times and put it in my coat pocket and went back to cutting coal. They came back on the 16th day. I was at the mine entrance stacking timber when I heard the wagon. Not my wagon, I'd returned that to Deckard. Another one, a hire from Casper. Essa was on the bench with a driver I didn't know and the 3 sisters in the back and Weena sitting up, still pale but sitting up, with a wool coat on that I hadn't given her, and that I later found out Essa had bought with money she'd earned helping Alderman's sister-in-law clean the boarding house. Weena saw me from the wagon and said something in Cheyenne. Essa answered her without taking her eyes off me. The driver helped them down and turned the wagon around and left. I stood there with the timber in my arms like an idiot. Weena walked up to me. She was 11 years old and she came up to about my shoulder and she looked up at me and she said, "You are Caleb Amos Cutter." I said, "That's right." She said, "Essa told me about you." I looked at Essa. She was watching me with that same measuring look from the first morning, and there was something different in it now, not easier, but more settled. Like she'd made a decision at some point during those 16 days and was standing on the other side of it. I said, "How are you feeling?" Weena said, "I am better." The doctor said my lungs are clearing. She paused. She said you spent everything you had. I said I had something to spend. She said we have come back to help. I said help with what? She looked around at the mine entrance, the stacked timber, the cut grass hillside, the 40 acres of rough scrub. She said with this. I didn't know what to say to that. I looked at Essa again. Essa said we have no place to go that is safer than here. She said it plain, not asking anything, not making a case. Just a fact offered. Then she said, and you have a mine you cannot work alone. I said I can't pay wages. She said we know that. I said winter is coming hard in this part of Wyoming. She said we know that too. I said if Colbert or anyone like him comes out here. She said we will deal with that when it comes. Not you will deal with it, we will. I set the timber down. I won't make this sound easier than it was. Winter in the high grass near Table Rock is a particular kind of hard. We fixed the powder room into something livable. 2 more chambers cut out of the softer rock with tools I bought on credit from Deckard, who by this point had figured out something was going on and chosen, in his particular way, not to ask about it. Calla turned out to have a gift for working stone. Me could cook over almost nothing and make it taste like something. Essa and I worked the upper vein together most days, shoulder to shoulder in the narrow shaft, and she learned faster than anyone I'd ever taught. Weena read to us in the evenings. She had 3 books she'd carried all the way from the north in a canvas bag, and she read from them by the lamp in the way that educated, careful voice of hers. And I sat and listened and felt something I hadn't felt since a leaner. Not the same thing, different, but in the same neighborhood. Some nights Essa and I sat outside the mine entrance after the others were sleeping and watched the stars over Table Rock. She told me things in pieces, the way she'd told me things that first morning, and I told her things back about a leaner, about the mines, about the particular feeling of being a man who had been useful and capable all his life, and then waking up one day and finding that the world had quietly stopped needing him. She listened the way she did everything, steadily, without filling up the space. One night she said, "Is that what this is? A way to be needed again?" I thought about that. I said maybe it started that way. I don't think that's what it is now. She looked at the stars for a while. She said no, I don't think so either. Colbert came in February. I want to say I was surprised, but I wasn't. I'd been watching the road, and I'd had a conversation in December with Aldo Bream that told me the county commission had been talking about the Millard seam, and whether the condemnation could be reversed now that somebody was working it, which was not actually the county commission's business once a deed was filed. But Colbert had a brother on the commission, and that made it complicated. He came with 3 men this time. They rode up the draw in the morning fog, which was thick enough that they were 20 yards from the mine entrance before I could count them. I was outside with the axe, splitting what remained of the rotten timber for firewood. Colbert said, deed or no deed, Cutter, this land has got a question mark over it. County wants the mine inspected. I said the county inspected it in '81 and condemned it. I bought it condemned. There's nothing to re-inspect. He said the county says different. I said the county can put that in writing and file it at the land office in Laramie, and I will respond through proper channels. He looked past me at the mine entrance. He said, those women still up here. I said, my workers are up here, yes. He said, workers. I said, workers, I pay in share of production. That was technically true. We'd worked out a cut of the coal revenue, such as it was, once I'd sold the first load to the railroad depot in Red Fork. It wasn't much, but it was legal and documented, and Aldo Bream had witnessed the paper. Colbert stared at me. He had a certain kind of face, the kind that's used to people moving out of the way, and I was not moving. I am not a large man. I'm not particularly imposing. But I had spent 22 years in mines where the ground could kill you if you let it, and I had learned a long time ago that the thing you do with pressure is not to push back and not to collapse. You hold your line and you let the ground decide. He said, this isn't done. I said no, come back with the paper from Laramie. He left. What happened next is a long story I'll shorten. Aldo Bream, it turned out, had a deeper dislike of Colbert than I'd known, and a longer memory. The land office in Laramie confirmed the deed was clean, and the condemnation couldn't be reversed without cause. A man named Hess from the railroad came out in March to look at the coal vein and said it was worth a supply contract. Small, but real. By April, I had enough to pay proper wages. By June, the mine had a name on a board above the entrance, the Cutter and White Horse Seam. S's idea. I told her it should be her name first, and she said, "You were here first." I said, "You were here first, 12 days before I ever showed up." She looked at the sign. She said, "Then it is right." I will tell you about one evening in June, because it is the one I come back to. The grass on the hill above Table Rock comes up gold in June, a particular kind of deep yellow gold that you only see at that elevation when the light is late. I had been in the mine all day, and I came out in the late afternoon and sat on the rock shelf outside the entrance, and I was so tired I could feel it in my teeth. The kind of tired that is also satisfaction, which is the best kind. Essa came and sat beside me, not in front of me, not across from me, beside me, close enough that our arms touched. She said nothing for a while. We watched the light change on the hill. Then she said, "I have been thinking about something." I said, "All right." She said, "You paid 8 cents for this place." I said, "Less than a man ought to pay for 40 acres. She said, "You got more than 40 acres. I looked at her. She was looking at the hill, the gold light, the way the grass moved. She had a cut on her right hand from the morning's work, and her hair was down, because she'd lost the cord that held it and hadn't found another. She looked the way a person looks when they have been through a great deal and come out the other side not smaller but larger and more completely themselves. She turned and looked at me. The way she looked at me I will not try to describe exactly. I will say that it was the first time since Alina that I felt fully seen, not the old mine foreman, not the man who'd spent down to nothing, not the lonely man above the hardware store. Just me, Cutter, the man she had recalibrated herself for. She put her hand over mine on the rock. Her hand was rough and warm and certain. She said, "You are a good man, Caleb Amos Cutter. I knew it that first morning when you set the bar down." I said, "I almost didn't." She said, "But you did." I turned my hand over under hers and held it. Below us the draw was quiet. Weena was reading to me in the powder room. You could just hear her voice, the careful sentences drifting up out of the dark. Calla was somewhere on the hill. I could see the small, pale shape of her shirt in the gold grass. The sun went behind Table Rock, and the hill went from gold to gray to a quiet blue. I said, "I had 8 cents and a pry bar and nothing particular to do with either of them." She said, "And now?" I looked at our hands on the rock. The mine behind us and the 40 acres of rough scrub and the railroad contract and the name on the board and all of it. I said, "Now I have considerably more." She leaned against my shoulder, easy, natural, like she'd been doing it for years. We sat like that until the stars came out over Table Rock and Weena's voice drifted up through the rock below us, and the night was cold and clean and entirely ours.